Jamagayirabini, Ninjuan. That is the local Kurraga language for good afternoon, everybody, spoken with my accent. Let us acknowledge that we live and work on the unceded lands of the Darug-speaking people of the Yuin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Particularly honour their deep culture of caring for each other and the country in ways that were sustainable and ongoing for many thousands of years. And I would like particularly to acknowledge that many Aboriginal tribes and nations live for tens of thousands of years caring for this country with, as I understand it, very little violence. There's a lot we can learn from the oldest living culture if we're open to this. So again, I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Oh, too much football.
Shut the doors just because all those beautiful kid noises are a little bit distracting. So most of you know that I'm Hollie Bakerboljkovac. I'm a counsellor in town. I'm in private practice. And I live in Mogalo and I work in Bombay, so I feel like I kind of have a taste of all the different land that's here, you know, the rainforest and the limestone country, and of course we've got Braidwood nestled in between those. And I, you know, kind of further to what Julia just said, I acknowledge that the deeply integrated Indigenous culture which has been here for thousands of years, and also our more recent colonial history that has shaped the Braidwood that we know today. And I think that we can't talk about violence in Braidwood without acknowledging the colonial history and the state violence that changed the landscape here and the social fabric of the people who have lived here in all those different times over the past 250 years. We know that the ability to hold land and power and resources in this area was made possible through the use of violence in forms such as control of resources, displacement, genocide, imprisonment and warfare. And I sit here, and you know, looking around, I think we all sit here in this room as educated white people with the privileges of a stable home, my health, a version of financial stability, due to my ancestors' position in a culture that has historically valued some people above other people. And so these values have been upheld by the violent structures and systems which we all, I believe, have a responsibility to attend to and put an end to today. And I personally view this sort of broad systemic issue of violence as a mythology. It's like it's a story that holds power and domination as our main character. And it's a story and a mythology that our cultures subscribe to and engaged in for far too long. And we each have the ongoing opportunity to make changes and choices that make sure that violence is no longer the leader. So that's kind of where I come from today. And when I think about, you know, that saying, in violence we forget who we are, that's sort of a baseline for that. Just wanted to give you a little bit of history about how I came to be involved with all of this locally. I was first invited to be involved with a group, there was a group, but it didn't have a name at the time, which is now known as Braidwood Says No to Violence, in 2017. And there were a group of concerned residents who were looking at issues of domestic violence in the community and options for a safe house in our town. And as we explored this topic, and I went away and did a lot of research for the group and spoke to caseworkers in Canberra and just got a lot of different information, what we found was that providing a safe house for Braidwood was a project that was much too large for the volunteers involved. And so instead what we wanted to offer were projects to educate about violence and also provide spaces for conversations and discussions like this, you know, where we'd be able to, that felt at the time that was the best place for us to offer our energy as volunteers that could serve some sort of active change against violence, I suppose. So it's now a local group under the auspice of the Braidwood Life Centre, which we sit in today. Our main aim is to address public bias and misunderstanding around domestic and family violence. And the group is made up of professionals in the helping fields and community members who care. And we purposely don't publish the names of who's in that group for all the reasons that it would be obvious, right? A bit of privacy and just a bit of care for the people that are involved. So I'm usually like quoted as the person sitting as the chair and having sort of that public persona as a councillor, but there's many people who are also sitting beside me, and I want to acknowledge all of them today, because today's project wouldn't have happened without everyone doing that together. So in the past, this group has worked with other groups and businesses in the surrounding area to support locals to say no to violence. And this particular project, In Violence We Forget Who We Are, hasn't been any different. We've all brought our own things together, and of course, you know, Bowie has given us the artwork. We've had different people contribute to the web page that's connected to the QR code, and the invitation to the whole community to attend, right? It's the different groups that have been welcomed as part of today's presentation. We don't just have a poster, we have a colouring page as well. So on the website you can download a colour in, and you can use that within your group or your family or whatever education setting that you'd like to continue that conversation around the impacts of violence. So in the early stages where this group was becoming a thing and people started to talk about it, I would often hear the question about, like, is violence even really that bad? We're like, we don't have violence in Braidwood. There's not domestic violence in Braidwood. People would truly say that. And I can tell you that as a clinical counsellor in private practice who does not actively advertise for domestic violence, like I don't say that I'm a domestic violence counsellor, but I've done the stats on my clients over the past 5 years, and the numbers tell me that across my entire caseload, intimate family and partner violence is present in 85 to 90% of people I see. And so what I mean by that is that a person that I sit with in the room will have either grown up in a home with family violence, have been in a relationship with a partner where violence is present, or they're currently in a violent family situation. It's 85 to 90% of people that sit in my room. Yeah? So yes, domestic violence does exist in Braidwood. We've all grown up in a culture that glorifies, pedestals, allows violence in the form of institutional power, and the less subtle forms that we can all think of pretty clearly. Even the most peace-loving pacifist is impacted by violence because we exist within a structure that's built on the very thing that we're talking about here today. And this is complex work. So even if we say, I don't do violence, I don't see violence, I don't talk to people who are violent, it's so complex into the structures of everything that we've ever known around us that we can't just, like, not be a part of it, right? To make the big shifts that are necessary, we all have to check our own bias and privileges as a matter of course, and not just once, but regularly and in different settings, because we're all responsible for remembering who we are. So various studies have shown that violence against women is at a higher rate in rural and regional areas. Our webpage, which was created for the poster, so it kind of focuses resources on 4 areas of impact: impact and effects on children, impact and effects in community, statistics in community, and then ally guides. So that's like, what can I do to help? And how can I respond? Violence impacts and influences us all, and I think in small communities or subcultures, any act of violence impacts more than just the person that's in direct receipt of the violence. So we're all affected by what goes on. People react in different ways based on their own previous experiences. And in violence, we can forget the impact it has on the individuals who are not just in the relationships, but outside the relationship as well. So for this current project, we continued our focus on education around violence, but we wanted to make it something that was more than just relevant to the 2622, just to Braidwood. What could we do that would actually be addressing the national issue? Because it's not as simple as saying Braidwood only, violence only exists in Braidwood. Also, it's not as simple as saying violence is everywhere, right? How do we do a project that addresses all of that? And this is how we came to go with this poster, which then has these downloadable features. And of course, more resources can continue to be added because digital makes it not, doesn't have to stay the one way forever. In violence, we forget the impact that all of these kind of filters have on everyone's daily life. So our committee also wanted to work toward a project providing education to influence parents and families to think about how children are impacted by violence, and not only at home, but also at school, on the sporting field, and anywhere else. Children see everything, even the stuff that we think we're hiding from them. And in violence, we forget the impact it has on vulnerable minds. So violence is never an easy topic to discuss, and it doesn't mean that we should shy away. I think in violence, anyone can forget who they are. And our hope is that these resources will help you or your clients or your groups, members of your groups, to stay safe and stay focused and stay connected and stay compassionate and get educated about what we can all do together. And finally, from me, the quote, "In violence we forget who we are," comes from a paper that was first published in 1961, written by Mary McCarthy. She was an author and social critic, and she had a particular interest in culture and power. She opposed war quite publicly, while at the same time she engaged in a public feud with another female author. So our choice to use this quote draws on the rich history of violence critique, which I think we all sit pretty firmly and comfortably in, while still acknowledging that we're all individuals who've been raised in a culture that preferences power and domination, and all the political structures that go with that, but remembering that we're all learning as we go. That's me done.
So a little change of pace.
Yeah.
I don't know.
If you've got questions, we'll do questions at the end. We're going to do a little panel-y sort of thing. So just follow those questions for now.
So for those that don't know, I'm Julia Green, and a relatively new resident of Braidwood. And Hollie invited me to be part of this panel because I have a background in social work, and I will just talk a little bit about that and some of the things that have come from that. Thanks for inviting me. It's so sweet, and I do applaud what you're doing. Absolutely. So I retired from social work 11 years ago, and I haven't really had my social work hat on since then. I've had my social justice hat on a bit in Braidwood through the Two Fires Festival. Anyway, I thought I would start with some brief observations from my social work career which are relevant to the topic at hand, because I worked for many decades in child and family welfare, whatever it was called in different settings. So going way back, in the mid to late 1960s, my first job was in foster care in the New South Wales Child Welfare Department, as it was called then, where the ruling legislation stipulated that, quote, "the needs of the child shall be paramount," unquote. But the prevailing practices and interventions frequently resulted in further abuse of children and escalating trauma. In the 70s and beyond, I worked with the welfare branch in Canberra, and the work included general child and family welfare, investigating violent abuse and neglect, violence, abuse and neglect, adoption and foster care, and children's court reporting. There and then, the prevailing attitude and response to violence in the home was to take no notice. It's just a domestic, the police said, as they turned their attention to other matters. In the days when family abuse was barely on the public radar. It's not that long ago. Later, after I had my kids and was at home with them for a while, I worked for several years as a counsellor in the ACT Catholic high school system, where I saw violence and abuse crossing all socio-economic backgrounds and astounding us when highly respected men were identified as perpetrators, and where I learned more about the cyclical nature of violence and abuse. My last job was from 2000 to 2010 in ACT Community Health, addressing the needs of newly forming families in the field of maternal and perinatal mental health. So working with the maternal and child health nurses in the small social work team. And there I learned so much about the power of early intervention and supporting parents to care well for their infants and young children as a key means of breaking cycles of abuse and of preventing violence developing. So I've become increasingly interested in examining the causes and sources of violent and abusive behaviour, and thereby looking at ways of preventing this behaviour and promoting more healthy ways of treating each other. So my perspective here relates to the origins of violence in our society. No easy solutions, but some fairly clear paths that we could follow. I googled origins of violence the other day, and I came across this quote from UNESCO Courier a year ago, 2020 to 2021. So I'll just read this quote. Violence is not inscribed in our genes. Its appearance has historical and social causes. The concept of primordial or original violence is a myth. War is therefore not inseparable from the human condition, but is the product of societies and the cultures it generates. As the studies of early human societies show, when faced with a crisis, a community is more resilient if it is based on cooperation and mutual support, rather than on individualism and competition. And if that wasn't evident in this community a couple of years ago, then I don't need to say more about that. So I made just a brief list of some of the key, as I see it, origins of violent behaviour to consider when looking at solutions. And all of these could be talked about and workshopped and investigated, discussed for a long time. Early childhood trauma, intergenerational trauma, and we see that with the Aboriginal people, the intergenerational trauma that they continue to experience. And we also see it in the non-Indigenous, and Indigenous communities with people returning from wars, totally traumatised and, in the past not acknowledged at all, and how that impacts generation down to generation. Insecurity of income and housing is another possible origin cause of violent behaviour. Lack of social supports and connections. And I also add fear, because I believe that a great deal of violent behaviour comes from a place of fear, and it can be fear of not being good enough, fear of not providing well enough, fear of all sorts of things. But I think that's a key element in violent and abusive behaviour. So out of all of those, as you've probably gathered, early childhood trauma is the one that I probably have worked mostly with and perhaps know more about. And I must say that I'm pretty horrified these days, this is since retiring from the field, to read and hear about escalating rates of debilitating depression and anxiety in new parents, and of untreated traumatic birth experiences, all of which impact on their capacity to meet the needs of infants and young children. And I know, I'm very aware there are systemic issues involved with that, with all of that. I also think there's a lot more that communities can do to better support new parents, thereby helping to prevent violence developing and breaking cycles of abuse. A little anecdote, in the Netherlands, and I know this because I was there when my fourth grandchild was born, a government-funded specialised nurse visits the home of every newborn baby every day for 8 to 10 days and stays all day. And she will do anything that's needed to cocoon the mother and the baby. She'll take the other kids for a walk, she'll put the washing on, she'll do whatever, so that the mum has a chance, a proper chance, to be supported as she recovers from labour and as she gets to bond with her infant and take care. I mean, it's so far from what happens in this country. It's extraordinary to be there. My daughter-in-law at the time said, I can't feel anxious. She just knew this calm, knowledgeable, competent woman was going to be there every day. So it's, what I would like to do also is, on this subject, share with you this book called, fairly appropriately, Parenting for a Peaceful World. You know, is it Hollie or
No,
not?
but I know the author.
You know Robin Gill? Yeah, okay. Yeah. I read this, it was published first in 2005, and I read it probably soon after that. And it's been a pivotal book for me. He looks at parenting, family life in the context of community and society over big time, and looks at how things have moved and changed over big time. And it's quite a challenging, it's a very challenging read, because looking after children, oh well, anyway, there's been all sorts of horrific things that have happened in that space over time. However, it's a positive book. He says that we are moving in a better direction. But I'd just like to read a couple of things from the back cover to start with, and then one of the things he says in there. Yeah, because I think this is such an important book. Sheila Kitzinger, a birth activist, I don't know, quite a while ago now, I think. I don't know if she's still alive or not. But anyway, she wrote, "The way we think and behave as parents does not only affect our relationship with a child, or even that child as an adult. It creates the society in which we live. It shapes the future of the world." Robin Gill explains how authoritarian parenting and denial of intimacy can create hatred and violence that warps our culture. Another piece from the cover, Robin Gill's advocacy for an authentic connection with our babies and children leaves no alternative in social evolutionary terms. His distressing but eye-opening survey of historical horrors exposes the false dichotomy of coercive versus permissive baby rearing. And I'd just like to perhaps finish with a little quote from his preface. He says, "Our understanding of early childhood development has grown so rapidly in recent years that we can now say the following with unprecedented confidence. The human brain and heart that are met primarily with empathy in the critical early years cannot and will not grow to choose a violent or selfish life." I recommend it. There's actually, I did donate a copy to the Life Centre a while ago, so if anyone's interested, feel free to reading, but it's, that might be one for me. There's lots of things that I could say. Thanks.
And so now thank you, Julia. I want to go back to the quote off the back, but we'll get there later on the panel. Great. Now I put my hat on and I'm Amanda. So Amanda had already written a speech before she became unwell, and she asked if we would share at least some of it. Of course, like all of us, the notes are not perfectly written, so I'm just going to kind of fumble my way through and get the points that I think she most wanted for you guys to hear. So some of you will know Amanda Burton. She lives in town. A little about her working life is she was a nurse, she was a volunteer for CAPS Crisis, she was a health educator and community educator, and then finally she worked in child protection. So she's been in the helping professions for quite a while, and she's seen quite a bit. And she is now retired as well. So I'm going to introduce Amanda first and say that she contacted me last year when we were having some, intense times in the community, and she said she would love to be able to provide her skills and experience in a way that could add to the kind of projects that Braidwood Says No to Violence was doing. So it was really Amanda that sort of sparked what this project became, actually, for today. And part of it was because she wanted people to understand the impact that violence has on children's brains and lives. So it kind of builds on what you were saying, Julia. And she's got some pretty full-on stories, so I'm going to share them, and I will say, as the counsellor in the room, that if any of these stories shake you, then we're here to, hold you around that. But if it becomes too much, you're welcome to leave the room. I would always ask that you come back so that we know that you're okay. So can I have an agreement from everyone about that? Awesome. And you may or may not want the boys to hear this. So Molly was 3 years old, a dear little girl with a sadness in her eyes, and she was always hiding and was very quiet. Her mum had been strangled by her partner many times and had caused cognitive impairment. And to escape, Molly's mum used alcohol and other drugs. At times she was very hard to reach, and talking to her about Molly's future was very difficult. So this is Amanda explaining this as the worker, working with Molly's mum. Sometimes Molly's mum would say that she should let Molly go into care with her aunt, and other times Molly and her mum would disappear, away from her home, where she witnessed more violence and often neglect. Eventually Molly did live with her aunt, and she started preschool and became a chatty little girl who had a stable home and did see her mum. So the impact of one person's violence on everyone involved changed so many of the lives around that family. Another story that I heard Amanda tell as well. Sam was a primary age child that Amanda was working with, and Sam could only attend school for 2.5 days per week due to his behaviours being disruptive for the class. Sam was not able to take his backpack off in the time that he was at school, so as in it wasn't that he wasn't allowed, but he just didn't want to ever take that backpack off, some sort of security. Sam would also run to the front office every few minutes just in case his mum was there to pick him up. So you can imagine that sort of chaotic, scattered fear, like you said, fear. When Amanda visited the home, there were holes punched in every wall and door, and his mother Sally was not emotionally available nor physically able to meet Sam's basic needs. Sally's partner broke her jaw and her cheekbone, and he was arrested and awaiting court. Amanda was very troubled by Sam's behaviour, and then around that time she completed some courses with the Australian Childhood Foundation about children's trauma in the brain. I'm over the edge of that story. There's probably more if Amanda was here to tell us. I know where that story is going in terms of, there's the children that are sent to school when they're living with that level of violence are incapable of sitting down and being quiet and learning. Yeah, that's the point of that story. So she's got an example here. The teacher told Johnny to go to the cupboard and take out a yellow piece of paper and write his name in the top right-hand corner. So that's a lot of instructions, right? Go to the cupboard, take out a yellow piece of paper, write your name in the top right-hand corner. So a lot of specifics. For Johnny, he was up out of his desk, over to the cupboard, forgot why he was there, then he went to talk to his friend, then he's in trouble for disrupting the class, then he gets sent out of the class, etc., etc. So I guess what we're seeing in this sort of, little glimpses that I'm giving you from Amanda's talk is something that's happening at home that we can say, like you said, the police say it's just a domestic, then is impacting all these other things down the line. So, the naughty kids at school, are they naughty, or is there something else happening that's affected them to the point that they can't concentrate and they're disruptive in the classroom? Early childhood is a time of tremendous brain development. The young brain literally changes shape and size in response to everything that it encounters in early years. New environments, life experiences, parents, family relationships, they all affect the way complex brain circuits are wired. So this network of synaptic connections will ultimately determine brain function and the development of behaviour. It's not just the kid in the classroom when he's 6, but that's the brain that continues to develop right up into adulthood. And developmental outcomes can be seriously impacted if kids are deprived of, as your book just said, the social and emotional nurturing in this developmental process. So then Amanda's got points about, well, how is it repaired? It's not all lost, right? Just because Johnny couldn't get to the cupboard and get that yellow piece of paper that day doesn't mean that it's lost. If the teacher can take Johnny to the cupboard and ask him to take out a yellow piece of paper, then take him back to the desk, then show him where the right-hand corner is, then ask him to write his name. So that allows the child's neural pathways to kind of go into the calmness of that and sort of reconnect and couple where we want them to be, where that learning brain can focus. But if it's not corrected with kindness, the child becomes disruptive, is always told that he's hopeless, naughty, nuisance, bad boy, and is sent to the principal and is suspended from school. So last week in Braidwood, there was a massive fight at the school that some of you might have heard of. This is a perfect example of, like, we can sit there and say, well, look at those naughty kids having a fight, or we can, and how do we address that? Do we just send them home and say they're all naughty? Or what could we do as a community in kindness to change the shape of those brains, right? Because that naughty kid that gets suspended from school, that then becomes the dominant story at home too. So then you're in trouble at home, and then maybe in trouble at school, and so then therefore I as the child must be hopeless and dumb, and that's the cycle into the juvenile justice system, and then that just continues the same story, and you know, what do we get at the end of that? Children exposed to complex trauma have attachment difficulties, relationship insecurity, sexual behaviour. I mean, everyone has sexual behaviour. I'm sure she means, like, you know, unusual sexual behaviour maybe. Trauma-related anxiety, conduct problems and defiance, inattention, hyperactivity, as well as uncommon problems such as self-injury and eating disorders. The neglect that some children will experience in the face of homes that are full of violence does cause long-term harm to children who normally go on to have complex mental health problems, and leads to, you know, all those things I just mentioned, but obviously right through into suicidal ideation. Often children are fleeing violence, so all their possessions are left behind. They don't have things that they can pin their memories to, like children from stable families or homes can. So there's often not things that give comfort and tells that story of history and belonging. They can become empty and quiet, and often they could hoard food just in case they have to flee again. And I think that goes back to the story of the little boy that wouldn't take his backpack off. So to support a mother and her children in the home where possible has far better outcomes than children having to flee and be removed from their homes. And I think as a community, or if we're thinking about programs that we create as helping services, we can focus on the family as a whole and support the growing development of kindness and compassion in those families, and then as a broader community. One example of this is where DVCS provided, so DV Services provided in-home security for a woman and her children that remained in the home. This was in the form of back-to-base security cameras, ample mesh screens on the doors, a police alert at the address and case management, so support from other agencies. This program gave the mother and child stability and continued connection to the community and safety. So remember before, so I'm Hollie again now speaking, remember before I said we thought we wanted a safe house here in Braidwood? And that, I mean, that'd be amazing, right? But we didn't have the resources at the time. Currently, our issue is if we need to send someone to a safe house in Braidwood, the closest is Goulburn or Queanbeyan. So we're taking that family out of their community, and then where's that support, right? Back to Amanda. Instead of only making experts in the impact of trauma on the brain, we should be teaching the parents about all of this education and showing them that that's a part of the answer to ending violence in the home. It's not just as simple as saying to somebody, violence is bad, but if we can show them what it actually does to their children and what it does to themselves, maybe that's a way in, is what she's saying. So we also have to examine our history and culture, which I think Julia and I have both spoken to today. These will take lifetimes to change. So what we can do is start by slowly being kind. We can start by being kind to each other and slowly reshaping those complexities in ways that are meaningful for everybody. That's Amanda. Cut for
Can I just add a little bit, going back a way, about the impact on children is just so potent and so strong. And the younger the child, the deeper in it goes. It becomes unconscious. unconscious and there's no, not necessarily a memory of it, so it has even more potency. I remember when I was working in the field, we were taught that if there's violence in the family and the baby's not even born yet, I mean, you know stories people have seen, lovely videos of babies and the parent plays beautiful music, a particular song, and when the child is born, the child just responds to that song because they know it, they've heard it, they've experienced it. Similarly, at the other end of the spectrum, unsafe things happening to the child before even birth is affected, and the child's developing brain and developing. I'm not a neurological expert and I'm not even a physiological expert, but the reaction to the fear reaction is apparently measurable in these unborn babies. That's really sad. Yeah, but so much of what was said there.
And it shows how how deep it is, right? Like how it's not as simple as saying, well, we'll just teach them different, take the baby out of the house and put them in a loving, kind family and they'll be fine. But it's the complexity is so much deeper than that.
Another thought, if I may share it, is that in responding, historically it's the mother and the child or children that leave, so they leave their home and the perpetrator gets to stay there, which is not exactly okay. In addressing it, it's a time in a cycle of life when often that's the cycle of abuse that you're seeing. That the perpetrator, if it's the father, probably usually is, not universally. What's his story? It's quite understandable that we react with horror, and he should be put away for whatever is a common response. What's his story? It's not that he is just behaving randomly badly. I would hesitate. I would probably say 100% of the time he has a story, and if you knew about his early childhood experiences and or trauma that he had experienced in his life, it needs to address how we respond, I think, as a community. And the punitive response is not actually helping to break the cycle. And there is this opportunity because generally, a dad that is violent, he loves his kids and he loves his wife and he didn't want to behave like that. And it's a trigger, it comes from somewhere. And if somehow the response can engage him and in a, if I'm making any sense, that you sort of, I don't quite know how, because you've got to stop the behaviour. The behaviour's not okay. And the impact it has on kids and women or whoever's being abused is totally not okay. So the behaviour has to stop. But it's, as well as that, there needs to be this understanding, I think, in the response that the perpetrator has a story, and it's probably a pretty hideous story. As well.
And plus, like we've said, within a system that has a story.
Yes, indeed.
And this is why, the throwaway lines like she should leave or he should get locked up or let's kick them out of the community or whatever it is. That's not the answer, right? These are complex situations that require, like I said, a lot of looking at our own bias and privilege. Finding compassion for stories that we may not approve of. But meeting somewhere, because what we know about brains that we might not have known in the 1970s when they told you, it's just a domestic, is that stuff can be changed. We can reshape a brain, we can reshape those connections, but it's not done by yelling at someone and telling them they're shit. That's not the answer. So from here, I guess, now that you've all heard all that we've said, is there any comments you want to make? Is there any where would you like to see today go? Anna has some questions that we'd sort of already put together that we thought were helpful educationally, but we'd love to hear from you as well. What's your thoughts? What's your whatever?
what is your, so acknowledging everything that goes on in our community, what, when you started these organisations, what did you want, what goals have you set out to work towards, or, so is it about, maybe looking at the punitive response to domestic violence, and you want to do something down that line, or is it more about supporting victims? Is it more about education in schools? Like, when you see it, what's your dream?
Yeah, well, I think our aims are defined in the little constitution that we have to make, so that terms of reference it's called, so that we can get the grants, and it's really about educating the public about violence with the intention of making it stop. That's our goal. We're just all little volunteers doing our own businesses, lives and things. But I feel, and I think the group has kind of formed around this idea that if more people knew more, thought more, develop more, recognise more. So the first project we did was a recognise, respond and refer project. So that was a lecture that I put together, and we delivered that 3 times in the community. Once we specifically targeted businesses. Second time I think was just broadly open, and then the third time was more bringing everyone together, and with that lecture in mind, asking the community what we wanted from that. And what came out of that was the book that we then put together. It was a set of 10 articles that I wrote for the paper when we still had our Braidwood Times. And then that got put into an ebook, which is also available on the Love Centre website. And that whole thing came out of people saying, well, if the problem is everywhere, we need to start by making sure that people understand the biases and the myths, the boys will be boys myths, or the she should leave myths, or all those things. So we really tried to address that. We tried to address the fact that there's not just one type of violence that involves bruises, but there's 9 categories of violence when we talk about domestic violence, and how emotionally and mentally we can actually be even more impacted than a bruise. So they're the sorts of things that we were aiming to